Stephen Chittenden. Just come out to 10 minutes past 2 o'clock. It's afternoon edition here on 5 Live. Nihal and Sarah through till 4. Jordan Peterson is without doubt a big thinker, an acclaimed clinical psychologist who's studied and spoken about so many aspects of who we are. But he is also a man who's not afraid to speak his mind and get political.
His stance on issues such as gender pronouns have set him apart from many fellow academics in Canada, his home. His new book is called 12 Rules for Life, an antidote to chaos, and it maintains that striving for happiness as a goal in itself is a pointless exercise. I hope him and Pharrell get to have a conversation about that one day. Jordan, welcome to 5 Live.
Hi.
What do you make of that song, Happy by Pharrell?
Oh, I actually like the song. So, and it's a perfectly good thing to sing about.
Yes, yes. But if you are pushing forward the idea that happiness is the be-all and end-all, and that is the ultimate pursuit of being, then that's problematic for you, isn't it?
Well, it's not a goal. It's something that you accept with good graces when it happens to descend upon you. But happiness isn't something that you can precisely pursue. It's also not the right pursuit because there's so many things in life that are difficult and even tragic that if your hallmark for whether your life is unfolding properly is whether or not you're happy, then you're going to be bereft when you're bereft. And that's going to happen to you quite frequently. And so you shouldn't pursue what should be a side effect of other pursuits. That's essentially the reason.
Immediately upon reading this book, it resonated with me as being born a Buddhist, that desire is suffering. And we are taught that from a very early age. And it reminded me very much of when my father passed away, that the Buddhist priest stood in front of all of us and went on about the inevitability of dying and how much we should accept that and how we tend to push that to the very back of what we want to think about.
Well, the problem with pushing those things to the back of what you want to think about is that it doesn't make you take the situation that you're in with proper seriousness. And if you don't take the situation you're in with proper seriousness, then you don't do everything you can to put yourself together properly so that you can withstand the slings and arrows of life. You know, you have to build yourself into a ship that can withstand storms and then captain that ship properly. And that's not at all the same thing as being happy. I mean, how would you feel on a sailing ship if the captain's fundamental orientation was whether or not he was going to be happy that day? It's just not, it's a juvenile idea, and it's deeply unsatisfying existentially and philosophically, and it doesn't work out practically, and it makes people miserable because it can't be attained. So it's altogether a bad idea, as well as being trivial and rather ignoble.
Where did it come from?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, there is the idea in that's built deep into the substrate of the American way of life that you have the right to pursue happiness. And I also believe that you have that right. And I think it's kind of a misunderstanding of the right to pursue happiness, which essentially means, according to the founders of American society, that you have the right to conduct your life the way you see fit, as long as you don't infringe on other people's right to do so equally. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable set of propositions. But to distill that into something like happiness is the end goal of life it's preposterous. And the thing is, what I really don't like about it is it's just not helpful for people, because then when they're suffering, which is very, very frequently, they also tend to think that there must be something wrong with them for feeling that way. And that's just simply untrue. Life is difficult, and bad things happen to people, no matter how well prepared they are. And you need a way of orienting yourself in the world that has a lot more nobility than the pursuit of happiness.
So you're better off striving for some sort of meaning in your life, Jordan, but that's going to be different for everybody. So where do you start? Well,
it's different and the same for everyone in some sense, It's the same in that meaning is to be found, as I am at pains to describe in the book, on what you might describe as the border between order and chaos. And so you're in order when you're doing things and everything is working out the way that you want it to. And you're in chaos when things fall apart and when new things are happening. And you don't want to be in order too much because you get stultified and bored and stagnant. But if you're in chaos too much, then you can't tolerate it. It's too stressful. So you want to be on the edge in some sense. And you want to be on the edge so you have some mastery, but you're furthering your abilities at the same time. And people find that exhilarating. Like if you watch a sports performance, for example, and you see an athlete, a gymnast, say, go out and perform a floor routine where they're not merely going through their paces, no matter how well trained they are, but stretching themselves right to the brink of disaster, that's when you see the most outstanding performances. Those are the performances that have everyone leap to their feet in spontaneous admiration, because you see a person simultaneously manifesting their discipline, their trained discipline, but also stretching themselves farther out into the unknown. And people regard that as a triumph of the human spirit spontaneously, and it truly is. And that's where meaning is to be found. And that instinct for meaning, that the fact that we can even feel that, is a manifestation of an instinct that helps guide us through life. And so that's something else I stress quite continually throughout the book.
How do you feel, Jordan, as a professor, as you look out upon a new generation of thinkers and you see them more and more consumed by likes, follows, shares, and that is the pursuit of happiness?
Well, it depends on, there's nothing wrong with appealing to a broad audience, let's say. There is something wrong with pandering to the crowd. It's also very dangerous because the crowd is full of whims, partly because it's not always made up of the same individuals. If it's good to have a dialogue with your audience. Like, I keep an eye on my Twitter account and I keep an eye on my email, and partly because I'm looking at the critical responses to see if I've said things that I shouldn't have said, or if I wasn't as clear as I should be. And so it's really good to stay in touch with your audience, let's say, because they're a corrective. But you don't want to make appealing to an audience the be-all and end-all of your vision, because what you should be doing, just like what you should be doing if you're running a company, is that you should be producing a high-quality product that people also want and need. And so you can listen to the crowd and they'll tell you what they want and need, but that doesn't necessarily help you produce the high-quality product. You have to get both of those things right.
The three of us currently in this conversation, the majority of people listening to Five Live, will remember a pre-internet world where shares and likes were not important. The point of my question was really about that generation who will not know that pre-world, so have nothing to compare it to. Therefore, potentially to become more and more consumed by the idea of how a like affirms who you are.
Well, the new generation has the additional challenge not only of mastering the normal social environment, say, or the pre-internet social environment, but also of trying to understand what sort of reality social media presents them with. It's a very difficult thing to get a handle on. So I have lots of, let's say, sympathy for young people who are trying to make that their world, because the social media world is so dynamic and so constant, or so dynamic and so constantly changing and transforming at a fundamental level that it's hard to stay on top of it. And obviously you shouldn't be opaque to something like a Facebook like, because it does indicate that people are positively predisposed to what you're doing. And you shouldn't be struck down by the absence of such things. But I think it's very difficult to calibrate. It's very difficult for young people to calibrate their responses properly to what's happening on social media, because no one knows how to do it.
Jordan, this is your second book, 12 Rules for Life. The first one took 13 years. I know you were doing other things at the same time, so it's understandable that Maps of Meaning, the Architecture of Belief. What was the genesis of this book? How did it all start, the short version?
Well, Maps of Meaning was transformed into courses that I taught first at Harvard, then at the University of Toronto. And the courses were very popular. And then the course was made into a 13-part each episode was half an hour TV series on a public television station, for whom I also did a number of long format lectures, about 5 of them. And they also turned out to be very popular by the standards of such things. And I've been asked by very many people over the course of the 20 years I've been teaching about this material if I could produce something that was more suitable for a broader public consumption, because Maps of Meaning is quite a difficult book. And not so much purposefully so, but because I was trying to solve a set of problems rather than to more particularly communicate with a broad audience. And a literary agent contacted me a couple of years ago and asked me if I would consider doing something for a more public audience. And I had written a list of 42 rules that I put on Quora, which became very popular. And so I distilled those down to 12, and this is the result. And so partly it's it's still a book that deals with very difficult questions, I would say, but it's also one that's written in a more narrative tone and that contains a fair bit of practicality. So that's the genesis of it.
And Quora is like an answers website for those who haven't used it before, is that right?
That's right. Anybody can post any question and anybody can post an answer, and then the answers are voted up and down.
You also, in 2016, you describe it in the book as becoming embroiled in a political controversy that drew an inordinate amount of attention. That also, I'm sure, will be a factor in how much this book is taken up and read and discussed. But for those who don't know, what happened in 2016?
Well, Canada passed a piece of legislation that purported to extend the protection of the Canadian Human Rights Act and the Criminal Code to gender expression and gender identity, and which all sounds fine and good, except buried in the fine print, which is necessary reading under such circumstances, were a set of policies that actually made compelled speech a legislative necessity in Canada. So for the first time in English common law history in our country, the government had legislated the necessity for using certain terms of address when dealing with other people. And I read the policies, and believe me, there were far more policies than merely those that were appalling, in my opinion. I read the policies very carefully for a variety of reasons and made a video saying that I'm not saying words merely because the government makes it a requirement, especially because I don't agree with the philosophy that undergirded the legislation to begin with. I said it was appalling that the government would dare to exercise control over the voluntary expression of speech. And so I said that very forthrightly on a series of videos that I made, and it caused an absolute political scandal that hasn't died down, I would say, in any sense since. And it's had repercussions everywhere. So,
how has the transgender community received it?
Well, first, we should be very clear about the fact that there is no transgender community. Like, transgender people are very diverse individuals, just like everyone else. And the idea that they speak with a single political voice and that voice is represented by activists is simply wrong.
Those that have spoken out then in public forums?
Oh, many of them agree with me. For example, I've got 40 letters from transgender people who say that they're sick and tired of being the radical left's newest poster boy for radical left ideology. And apart from that, there's a number of transgender commentators on YouTube who have very large followings who are perfectly happy with what I've been doing. So there's no consensus. I would bet, although I have no data, I would bet if you polled the so-called transgender community that the majority of them would be in support of what I've done. So
I'm not au fait with Canadian law, but governments do tell us how to speak, in the sense that hate speech, for instance, is somewhere where we are told the words that we can and can't say, and we'll be prosecuted for saying certain words.
No, we're only told the words we can't say. We're not told the words we must say. And that's exactly where I drew the line. And I'm not an admirer of hate speech laws either. I think they're deadly dangerous and are a big mistake most of the time. But
why do you think that?
Well, who defines hate?
The person who feels as though that they have been the victim of it.
But that's the problem. It's like there's no reason to assume that a person's feeling about whether they've been targeted unfairly, let's say, is an unerring guide to the accuracy of that feeling. Feelings are no proof of anything. They're indications that something might be going on.
But not having been a minority, presumably in Canada or indeed in America, you would not know how would that feel to be a victim of hate speech based on something you have no control over, your race, for instance?
Well, I'm not making the case that there's no such thing as hateful speech. And I'm certainly not making the case that hateful speech is abhorrent, because it is. I'm making the case that
people should be prosecuted for it.
legislating hate speech restrictions is far more dangerous than allowing hate speech, even though hate speech is dangerous. Because you enable a level of control over what people are allowed to say and think that is dangerous in the extreme. And it does boil down to who defines hate. And you can't say that it's the target of an intended act who defines what the act meant. Because that would mean that if someone, in your own life, if you insulted someone accidentally and they decided that they were crushed and traumatized by that they could have you thrown in prison. You might say, well, I didn't mean it. And they would say, well, that doesn't matter because that's how it made me feel. It's like off to prison for you. That is absolutely no way to run a legal system. Intent matters. rather than the mere feelings of the recipients.
So then it is the job of the law to discover the intent behind what they have said, yes? And then that would be a justifiable case for there being, in law, hate speech.
Well, I would still say that's not a justifiable reason for hate speech, but I would say that, yes, it's the responsibility of the legal authorities to ferret out intent to the degree that that's possible, and that's actually the hallmark of a sophisticated legal system. If it's only...
Well, what about of a civilized society?
Yes, of a civilized society.
What, if you can go around saying whatever you wish to people, however hateful that may be, with no recourse to the law, no sanction whatsoever, you feel that that's a sign of a civilized society?
Oh, there'll be plenty of repercussions. I mean, people will respond terribly to you if you're incautious with your speech, and they'll take you to task in all sorts of ways. And if you have any sense, you'll listen to them. But at least you'll be exposed out in the open where people can take shots at you.
So revenge rather than the objective nature of the law. So I could just go and punch someone in the face who caused me rather than recourse to a police officer.
No, you can't do that. You have to use reasonable recourse. I mean, one of the tenets of English common law is minimal necessary force. Like if I say something that you find offensive, you don't get to hit me. I mean, that isn't how it works.
What do I get to do if there's no recourse in law then?
Well, you could take me to task verbally. You could expose me publicly. You could debate me. You could make a case for why that's unfortunate. You could act nobly. You just had a story on just before I was on your show about a black guy who was being targeted very badly when he started playing sports and acted like a noble individual and played the game properly and remarkably, and everyone came around and thought he was a remarkable person.
But people didn't come around until it was made very clear by authorities that if you were to make statements like that, as you do today, you will be ejected from the ground, you will be banned from going to watch your favourite football team for as long as you live. So people brought laws in to protect those players so they didn't have to go out onto the ground and have bananas thrown at them.
Well, there's a difference between assault and speech, and to have things thrown at you is a form of assault. No, look, I don't want to have an argument about whether or not there is such a thing as hate speech or whether or not it's bad. My point was very straightforward. There's tremendous danger in allowing people to define hate, because who defines it? And you say, well, it's the intended victims. It's like, yes, that sometimes works, but there's lots of pitfalls in that because it doesn't take intent into account.
One of the 12 rules for life that you've put forward here is don't let your kids do anything that makes you dislike them. That is a hard one. That's a pretty hard one to follow, I would imagine. For most parents would be thinking, well, if only. How do you do that? How do you do that in practice?
That's an interesting response, because lots of people would say, well, I can't ever imagine disliking my kids. And I think that's an absolutely preposterous response, because anyone with any sense knows that children can do things that instigate feelings of dislike in you. Well, the point in that chapter is relatively straightforward, which is that you should act like a proxy of the environment for your children, because your goal as a parent for children between the ages of 0 and 4 particularly is to help your children regulate their behavior so that the natural inclination that other people have to love and admire children isn't destroyed by their misbehavior. Because what you want for your kids, obviously, is, if you're thinking about it, is you want your kids to be extremely desirable as a play partner for other kids. So they have to know how to regulate their behavior enough so that they can play fair. And also so that they can attend to adults in a proper and let's say, respectful manner so that the adults are willing to interact with them. And then you have children under your care, and wherever you take them, everyone is thrilled to see them, and the doors of the world open to them. And that's really your goal as a parent. And you can reach that goal in part by noticing when your children are doing things that disturb you. Because if they disturb you, the probability that they're going to disturb other people, assuming that you're a reasonable person, you might want to discuss that with your partner. If they disturb you, well, because, people can make mistakes. But if your children's behavior disturbs you and makes you want to take revenge on your children, then it's definitely going to disturb other people, and their revenge is going to be a lot harsher. It's just not fun to go to a restaurant or a public place and see. It's not fun for me to see a little 3-year-old kid who's cute as can be running about, causing all sorts of trouble, non-helpful trouble, and getting frowned at and getting looked at badly. when a little bit of discipline properly applied would have stopped that from happening in the first place. It's not good for the child, and really it's hurtful to not help your children understand how to behave in public.
So all of your children did exactly what they were told all their lives when you tried to discipline them?
No, I told them explicitly not to do what people told them. One of our rules in our house was don't follow stupid rules. Like I encouraged my children to be as autonomous as they possibly could.
So how did you instill discipline in them at a very young age?
It depends on how young. When
you're talking about 3-year-olds. So.
Yeah, well, we could go younger than that. When my son was about 9 months old, that was about when he was crawling around. The first thing I did was taught him what no meant, and I'd watch him crawl around, and then he'd go and head for the house plant or something like that, or maybe try to topple some books on his head, and I would just grab his leg and hold him and say, no, you can't do that, no. And I'd hold him long enough so he'd stop, and he'd usually cry a little bit then because children don't like being interfered with. And then as soon as he stopped, I'd let him go, and he'd go explore again, and then he'd do something that would get him in trouble, and I'd stop him again. And after about 3 days of that, careful attention, all I had to do was say no, and he would cry and stop. And then about a week later, all I had to do was say no, and he wouldn't cry anymore. He would just stop. And then he had maximal freedom in the house because I had taught him what he could investigate and what he couldn't. And I had taught him to regulate his behavior verbally, and then I could just let him go. And I just kind of keep half an eye on him. And if he was ever getting in trouble, I'd just say no, and he'd move off to something else. But like the chapter describes very carefully that in your household, you should have a minimum number of rules. Like excessive rules are a very bad idea, but the rules that you do have, you should enforce intelligently and effectively. And then you get the optimal balance between order and chaos in your household.
You're listening to Jordan B. Peterson. The book is called 12 Rules for Life. We have him with us for the next 20 minutes or so. Text on 85058. Kevin Bolton, I'm not quite sure what Kev was expecting, but he says, Jordan Peterson ventures into the BBC Lion's Den. I hope you get to talk about more than just his book. He's a hero for many of us in his fight for freedom of speech in Canadian universities and against PC and SJW culture in general. He gives us all hope in these dark, regressive times. At BBC 5 Live. It's just gone 2:30. After 3. And our guest for the next quarter of an hour is Jordan B. Peterson. 12 Rules for Life, an antidote to chaos is his latest book. Fortunately for us, it took him a lot less time to write it than it did his initial one, but he's been doing other stuff too. Of the 12 rules, rule number 6 is one that I'm particularly interested in, Jordan. Set your house in perfect order before you criticise the world. Not just order, perfect order. What's this about?
Well, it's a reaction to, what would you call it? To agitator culture, I guess I would say. Ever since the 1960s, our young people have been taught, both explicitly and implicitly, that the right way to change the world is to go find who's making mistakes, what system or what individuals, and then to go out and oppose them by protest and so forth. And I think I think we've had enough of that for a good while, as far as I'm concerned. Not that I don't think people have a right to protest, because obviously they do. But my sense is that there's dangers in that path, and some of the dangers are those that are posed by ideological identification, which posed a terrible threat to people in the 20th century. But even more importantly, I think that you act more effectively in the world if you take care of what is yours to take care of properly. And so I've enjoined my students over many years to, do things. It's become kind of a famous internet meme, like clean up their own rooms. And in that chapter, I study people like the Columbine High School killers and a mass murderer named Carl Panzram, who wrote a very interesting autobiography, who outline their reasons for their hatred of the world. Their belief that society itself is corrupt and needed to be either transformed or obliterated, and that the structure of being itself was untenable because of its suffering, and that everything should be altered and obliterated. And my answer to that is, before you criticize your social structures too intently, and not to say nothing of the structure of being itself, you should try to put your own house in order, which is a very difficult thing to do. It's said that it's more difficult to rule a city or more difficult to rule yourself than it is to rule a city. And that actually happens to be technically true. You could start by trying to put your language in order and by saying things that you believe to be true. And you could start by trying to put your room in order and making it beautiful. to see if you can even organize a tiny space properly before you go about preaching to the world about how it should be transformed. I think there's terrible danger in that. And so I've suggested and buttressed those suggestions in that chapter with explanations that people do everything they can to put themselves in order in a disciplined manner and to sort out the travails and difficulties within their own families before they dare to discuss what should be done on the world stage. It's the proper approach. It involves some humility and it involves some real difficulty. Like everyone knows, you have a family and you know how fractious family relationships can be. It's very difficult to put your own house in order. And if you practice doing that and you get good at it, you learn things that you can then take to new venues with tremendous success. You learn how to negotiate, you learn how to play fair, you learn how to talk straight, you learn how to say what you want and to listen to other people. I mean, these are major portable skills that help you do well in virtually any situation that you can come to. And there's an injunction to gratitude in it too. Like especially in the West, we've been handed this civilization that's magnificent and free and unlikely beyond conception. And before we embark as continual cultural critics, which is basically what students are taught to do in university, we should do everything we can to be worthy of the damn civilization to begin with. And that's not something to be taken lightly. So that's what that chapter's about.
So that's the macro. Let's look at the micro, and that will appeal, I think, and resonate with many of our listeners. Tell us about how you and Tammy, who's your wife, deal with your own arguments.
Well, the first thing we do is try to listen to each other. It's like, okay, well, let's say my wife criticizes me about something. The first thing I ask her is, well, we have a rule. First of all, you criticize the smallest amount that you possibly can. Right? You don't say, you made a mistake, therefore you're a bad person and you'll never change. What you say instead is, here's something you did, here's how it struck me, say negatively, and this is what I would like to have happen instead. But I'm willing to listen to you on the off chance that either my solution is untenable or my diagnosis is incorrect. It's something like that. And then if she tells me something like that, well, then I listen because I think, well, look, it's possible that she's wrong, and hopefully because then I don't have to change, but it's possible that she's correct, and in which case I should bloody well listen because maybe I'm doing something stupid. And she'll tell me that I'm doing something stupid and how to set it right, and then I won't have to do that stupid thing anymore, and we won't have to have a fight, and I won't have to walk into a wall. And so, our rule is, don't put up with things you don't want to put up with. Offer the person a solution instead of just a problem. Negotiate towards it, and then try to integrate it. And that works. Well, that works in all relationships, as far as I can tell. It works like a charm.
But I liked the physical action of you going into two separate rooms
yes.
and then asking yourself some very difficult questions about yourself before you. And this goes back to putting your own house in order before you start agitating outside. So just talk us through that, for instance, because what you just talked about was the very kind of simplification of it. But I'm very interested in those questions, difficult questions you have to ask about yourself.
Look, sometimes you auger in on an argument with your spouse, let's say, or your partner. You start untangling your whole relationship and insulting each other, and the argument gets very serious. And then you're trying to win, you're trying to defeat each other, and that's a very bad idea. So one of the things we learned to do decades ago, I would say, is to go into our room separately in the middle of an argument like that and to sit in contemplation and ask a very simple question, and it's a horrible question. Like, it's a horrible question to ask yourself. It's like you're outraged at your partner. You think they're every shade of damned soul. You wish that, they just go away and that you would win. You have to go into your room and you think, okay, correct as I am, I probably did some stupid thing somewhere along the way to increase the probability that we would end up in this conundrum. So you sit on the bed and you say, okay, what did I do in the last 6 months that was unforgivably stupid that increased the probability that we'd have this argument? And then if you contemplate and you are willing to receive the answer, let's say, you'll think of something. You'll think of some damn thing you did that was pathetic and useless and that increased the probability that you're not going to get through this argument. And then you can go tell your partner that. And that takes a lot of the... And they'll do the same thing. That'll take a lot of the rancor out of the argument because you admit to your own misdoings, And that's a very helpful thing to do.
So much of this is about us being willing to ask questions of ourselves that we don't, as you've just pointed out, particularly want to know the answer for.
Right.
You would say.
Yes. Well, the short term, you generally learn things painfully, right? I mean, that's how life goes. If you really learn something, it's usually painfully. And so if you ask yourself a question about the truth, about yourself, the response you get is often painful, and that's short-term pain, right? And so people will avoid it, think, I don't have to go through that pain. And fair enough, who wants to go through pain? But the problem is that most of the time, to thrive in the medium to the long run, you have to undergo a fair bit of short-term pain. And the pain that's associated with truth about yourself is firmly in that category. And so take the short-term pain. That's sacrifice. I talk a lot about that in the book. That's sacrifice. Give up what you have to give up today so that tomorrow can be better. And that might even be your good opinion of yourself that you have to give up.
How has your view or your feelings about or your stance on your faith, Jordan, changed over the years, if at all?
Oh, it's changed tremendously. I mean...
Where are you now?
Well, I would say that, first of all, the book in some sense is an answer to that question. I mean, I learned years ago that the foundational elements of Western culture are metaphysical or religious in nature. And I believe that is categorically true. So I was interested in the metaphysical assumptions. And one of the metaphysical assumptions of Western culture, one is you should speak the truth because the truth spoken brings proper order into being. And that's one of the most fundamental truths in the Bible. In fact, the Bible even starts that way, essentially. And it also says quite straightforwardly, in some sense, that human beings partake in the image of God insofar as they are capable of speaking forth good order from chaos. And I also believe that that's true. I believe that the idea that the individual is divine in some sense and deserves respect and sovereignty as a consequence, I also believe that's true. And so there are things about our classical religious structure that underpins the West that are not only true from a conceptual perspective, but as I lay out in the book, are true from a deep biological perspective as well. And so the whole book is a meditation on that to some degree.
Truth will set you free. Is that John?
And the world as well.
Yeah.
Well, Gloria Steinem said, of course, but before that, it will pee you off.
Well, yes, that's
which is the essence of this as well.
Yes,
it really. Yes.
Yes. Well, if it was so simple, if the truth just led you down a pathway of light to the Garden of Eden, everyone would be walking
We'd
that
all
path.
be down there.
Exactly.
Many academics would shy away from intense political discourse of the like on Twitter, etc. But as we've discussed with you, you do not shy away from it at all. But when you start to become branded by particular avenues of the press or media as things like, I've read, I mean, there's so many that I've read today, but the one that sort of seems to sing out to me is Belle of the Alt-Right. How do you feel about that moniker?
Oh, well, I'm actually quite neutral about it now. I mean, I've been called so many things over the last year that Belle of the Alt-Right hardly even registers on the...
It's one of the ones that I could use on the family show.
Yeah, well, part of it is that if you oppose the radical left, which I most certainly do, although I also oppose the radical right with equal vehemence, I would say, then it's incumbent upon those who defend the radical left to decide that you're a Nazi. Because obviously Nazis do oppose the radical left, so maybe you're one of them. And wouldn't that be convenient for the radical leftists? Because if you're an unreasonable person, then they don't have to take you seriously. But I am a reasonable person, and you have to take me seriously. And so I'm kind of a thorn in their sides, I would say. So, but it's part also the mark of the polarization that we're undergoing at the moment, which is a very dangerous thing. But, I've said...
How are you a thorn in the side of the alt-right?
Oh, well, because I'm not an admirer of identity politics. The radical rightists are playing identity politics just like the radical leftists. They just say, well, yeah, the world is divided up on racial grounds, just like the radical leftists claim, and I happen to be white, and I'm going to win this game. And my injunction to the radical right types has been, don't play the game at all. You play the game of the individual. Set your own house in order. Don't fall prey to that racial idiocy. We already did that in Nazi Germany. It didn't work out so nicely. We shouldn't do that again. And quit playing that game. Pay attention to your own life. Clean up your own house. Get your act together, tell the truth, and stay away from the bloody ideologues, because they'll tear you apart. And the terrible part of you will rejoice while you're being torn apart, and while society falls apart around you. It's like, we don't need to do that again. We could learn from the 20th century. And I've had thousands of letters from people who were tempted by the blandishments of the radical right, who've moved towards the reasonable center as a consequence of watching my videos and listening to what I have to say.
I read a fascinating interview with you, and you were talking about the plight of young men and how guys really need to get their act together. You went on to say the lack of an identifiable and compelling path forward and the denialism these kids are being fed on a daily basis and undoubtedly destroying them, and that is especially true of the young men. This show, we've covered widely the fact that suicide is the biggest killer of young men under the age of 45 in this country. It goes on in that interview to say, at this point, to my astonishment, Peterson begins to weep.
Yeah, well, it says, see, now it did it to me again. Look, last night, I was at this talk I gave, and about 1,000 people came, and about 500 of them stayed afterwards, and most of them were young men, and just one of them after the other comes up to me, and they shake my hand, and they say, look, I've been listening to what you've been saying for 6 months, and it's changed my life. It's like I was depressed, I was addicted to drugs, my relationships weren't working out, I was hopeless, I didn't have any goal. I started cleaning up my room and telling the truth and working hard on myself, and it's really working, and I just want to thank you for helping me. And I think, God, it's so sad that so many of these men, they've not had an encouraging bloody word, a real encouraging word in their entire life. It just takes a little bit of encouragement and care so that they're willing to set themselves straight to some degree and start trying. It's just a catastrophe that's so rare in their lives. And so, yeah, well, every time, because I see the same thing when I'm talking. My audiences are often composed mostly of men between, say, 20 and 35. Not exactly young, but young enough. And they're desperate for a discussion about responsibility and fair play and noble being and working properly in the world, and the idea, and to hear the idea that their lives actually matter, that if they straighten themselves up and fly right, that they'll have a beneficial effect on themselves and their family and the community, and that the world is starving for that. And for them as individuals, not for them as a group, but for each of them as individuals. So, yeah, it breaks me up. Every time the topic comes up, it breaks me up because it's so damn sad. And we're so stupid. We're alienating young men. We're telling them that they're patriarchal oppressors and denizens of rape culture and tyrants in waiting, and we fail to discriminate between their competence and their tyranny. And it's awful. It's so destructive. It's so unnecessary. And it's so sad. And so whenever I think about it, especially because of all that I've seen of it, it makes me sad, like deeply. It's so sad.
Why has it happened?
Oh, God, that's a complicated question. I mean, well, it's partly happened because every culture has a tyrannical element, I mean, our culture isn't perfect. There is oppressive elements to it. It's not completely fair. So some of it is just the age-old observation that you don't get a culture without a bit of a tyranny. A lot of it is resentment and failure to take responsibility. It's people saying, instead of looking at the part they play in making the world a dark and terrible place, they blame something like the patriarchy and then assume that all the men who compose it are somehow malevolent tyrants or tyrants in waiting. It's like it's ideological possession. There's just no excuse for it. It's motivated by resentment.
Does
mostly.
Feminism have a role to play in that?
Well, it depends on how you define feminism. If it's the feminism that says, wouldn't it be lovely if women could offer what they have to the world so that the world would be a better place on the same footings as men? Well, no, that's great. If it's the feminism that says that Western culture is an evil, corrupt patriarchy, then absolutely. There's no excuse for that sort of thing, and it completely dominates the universities, especially in the humanities. Like, we really believe, most left-wing academics believe, that the Western culture is a corrupt patriarchal tyranny. I mean, God, wake up. Most governments in the world are run by thugs, absolute thugs. They'll kick in your door and kill you in your sleep. In the West, we have, well, a wonderful civilization. People are as free as they've ever been. You can live well here as an individual. And to consider that, you know, a corrupt patriarchal tyranny, and to lay that at the feet of young men, and then to tell them that they have to be discriminated against because of the systemic, let's say, racism and misogyny of the past. It's appalling. And men are bailing out of universities at a rate. This is not my opinion. I've been tracking these statistics for 15 years. Men are bailing out of universities at a rate you just would not believe. There won't be a man left in the humanities in 15 years at this rate. All you have to do is look at the trends. It's quite obvious, and it's no wonder. So, and it's just appalling. And I've also been described as misogynist because, you know, I've been trying to strengthen young men. It's like, of all the ridiculous ideas, that strengthening young men is somehow misogynist. I mean, God, I can't even believe what you would have to think that that was a good idea.
Jordan, it's really interesting talking to you, and thank you for being with us on the programme.
Well, thank you very much for talking with me.
Jordan B. Peterson, and the book is called 12 Rules for Life, an Antidote to Chaos.
Okay.